Hello, and welcome to From the EBPL Archives, Encore presentations from the East Brunswick Public Library. I am your host, Melissa Hosick. This event was graciously funded by the East Brunswick Friends of the Library. To learn more about the Friends or make a donation, visit ebpl.org/friends. Now, enjoy the program. Option Green, Climate Change and Community is presented by the East Brunswick Public Library and the Friends of the East Brunswick Environmental Commission. Funding is provided by the American Library Association's Resilient Communities, Libraries Respond to Climate Change, and the East Brunswick Friends of the Library. Thank you to all of the public libraries who are our community partners. For more information about Option Green, visit ebpl.org/Option Green. Good evening, everyone. My name is Melissa Hosick, and I am the Adult Programming Librarian at the East Brunswick Public Library. Thank you so much for coming to our Option Green series that's hosted by the library and the Friends of the East Brunswick Environmental Commission. My name is Melissa Hosick, as I said, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. Before we get started, I want to thank the American Library Association's Resilient Communities, Libraries Respond to Climate Change initiative, which is funding tonight's event. Thank you to ALA. Hold on one second. I need to lower a volume. Thank you to ALA and all of our community partners for helping to bring these important discussions about climate change and sustainability to our neighbors. Please note that this event is being live captioned, and let me put that link actually in there for you. I'll put that in the chat box as soon as I'm done speaking. If you have any questions during the presentation, please preface with the word question to make it easier for us to see them. Please also be respectful to the others chatting with you, whether you are on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch. I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker for our discussion of the documentary, Decoding the Weather Machine, which will have a New Jersey spin. I'm guessing you figured that out by our presenter tonight. Dr. David A. Robinson is a distinguished professor of geography at Rutgers University and New Jersey State Climatologist. He is a frequent speaker on issues pertaining to New Jersey's weather and climate. Makes sense. He's a contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the U.S. National Climate Assessment. Dave is a fellow American Meteorological Society member and a recipient of American Association of Geographers Lifetime Achievement Award. Thank you, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks very much. And we found out that Melissa and I are both alums of Dickinson College, so we found something in common, although I predated her by quite a few years. But anyway, good evening, everyone. And it's really a pleasure to be back at the East Brunswick Public Library. I spoke there several years ago. Wish I could be there in person, but this also provides the opportunity for more, perhaps, to hear us, the folks in East Brunswick and the community partners around Middlesex County. So it's just a great opportunity for everyone to get together, and hopefully you've seen the video, Decoding the Weather Machine. It's just 2 years old, so it's still a very topical video, very topical program. And as Melissa said, I'm going to put a little bit of a Jersey spin on things when it comes to what was shown in that presentation. So moving on here. Whoops, Melissa, I can't advance my slides.
Hold on one second, and we'll switch over to my screen. And see, guys, this is why we have backups. Okay, well, just let me know when you need me to do advance.
All right. So I can't advance them, huh? Okay. All right, so next slide, please. Greetings from the State Climate Office. In case you didn't know, we had one in New Jersey. I hope many of you do know this. It's at Rutgers University. It's part of the Agricultural Experiment Station. I am in an appointed position. I was appointed 31 years ago, so it's totally obviously apolitical. I serve at the favor of the Dean of the Agricultural Experiment Station, and who is also leads the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences at Rutgers. And this is via a decree from Governor Byrne back in the late 1970s. So there is a tie into the state on this, but it's a position that's been held at Rutgers ever since Governor Byrne declared it as such. We're here to help people. We're here to answer people's questions, help you make decisions. It could be a decision made by the governor in a severe storm situation, or the Department of Environmental Protection, or Transportation, or Health, or it could be someone in the private sector seeking some information, or it could be just you, as you'll see in a little while, just knowing what to put on, where to put on a coat tomorrow morning, if you happen to be going out, or and also just help make climate decisions, weather decisions yourself. So not going to stretch that too long. I think it's very obvious to everyone, especially all of you who took the time to come in this evening, that weather and climate impact all aspects of New Jersey. Weather, the very short term, today, tomorrow, the next week. Climate, looking back in the past and looking weeks and months and decades into the future. They intertwine at about the 1 to 2 week, 3 week level. You can't be a good meteorologist without knowing your climatology, and vice versa. So anyway, these weather and climate impacts are across the board. A huge part of our gross national product is impacted by the weather, our health, our safety, the availability to have drinking water, our travel, so on and so forth. And here you can see examples from throughout New Jersey, be it an ice storm in the top right there with power outages, agriculture in the top left, the impacts of Sandy in the two bottom left, the left middle and bottom left figure, fires in the Pinelands, transportation, what exit are we from in Jersey, and recreation. Next slide shows you a few more of those examples. But from a pure meteorologic, climatologic standpoint, the breach of the Barrier Peninsula at Manahawkin, during Sandy in the top right, big snowstorm weighting down trees in the top right, the ice storm again, a drought. That's a cornfield in August. They shouldn't look like that. But on occasion we get that. Flash flood, pulling cars off a car lot and pulling them into a stream in Little Ferry 2 summers ago. The rare but not totally uncommon tornado in New Jersey. We had 9 in 2019 and 4 in 2020. And hail, the size of golf balls. Literally, that's outside of my office on the Livingston campus in Piscataway about 15 years ago. But we had several hailstorms of that size this past summer across in parts of the state. And that map of New Jersey just shows you 5 ballpark climate regions within the state where there's an impact from elevation, proximity to the ocean, latitude, the Pinelands there in the green, the industrial corridor, the more heavily trafficked corridor where you have urban effects on a micro to meso scale. So while a small state, we do have quite a variety in our climate, from north to south, east to west, coast to inland, and so on. Next slide. This gives you an idea, and you can see this on the state climate website, njclimate.org. These are bar graphs showing you the last 12 months of precipitation departures from normal on the top left and temperature departures from normal. This is based on an average of several dozen stations around the state. And with precip, you can see the first half of 2020 was on the dry side. The red bars show precipitation deficits for those months in the 1-inch range in 3 of those months. And then we got to the second half of the year and we turned on the spigot, really beginning with Tropical Storm Faye on, I guess it was the 10th of July. We were really starting to get a little worried about being dry, and then boy, we were wet for the most part through the remainder of 2020. On the bottom, you'll see the temperatures, and you can see that 10 of the 12 months in 2020 had above normal temperatures, and of those 10, 6 ranked as among the 10th warmest of that particular month, going back 126 years in the record book. We had none make it to the top 10 dry or wet in 2020, but we had 6 make it into the top 10 for warmth. Really quite remarkable. But 2 months, April and May were below average. That was the first time in 3 years we had 2 consecutive months below normal. That's how warm New Jersey has been. And we'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. Next slide, please. Okay, just a general cartoon of the Earth's climate system. And I show this briefly. I could give a whole lecture. I could teach a whole semester just on this one slide. It shows all the players, starting with the sun and all the spheres out there, the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the volcanic activity that can affect climate, the biosphere, be it desert, be it rainforest, and all things in between, and the hydrosphere, in particular our oceans. And all of these interact along with the cryosphere, which happens to be my favorite because I do study global snow when I'm not state climatologist and teaching. And that's snow and ice sheets and permanently frozen land, permafrost. And then front and center, you notice in there, is us. You can see the factories belching out smoke. You can see the agricultural lands. So we are a big part of this system, as we all know, and we saw in the video, and we'll talk about a little more here. So this is all encapsulated, and the point to make here, it's a system. It has no beginning. It has no end. Everything interacts with each other. You can't just separate one of these spheres out and talk about it without quickly bringing in other impacts from the other spheres. So without going any further with that, next slide looks at, we said this one I left in because, people are always looking the here and now. This is last winter, but there's shades of this in this winter. If you recall, last winter was very mild. It was the 3rd least snowy in 126 years in New Jersey. And it was because the polar jet stream was very circular. It didn't get wavy, and it kept the cold air bottled up to the north, and it didn't get down into our neck of the woods all that often. So we stayed mild and relatively quite snow-free. Now, when the jet stream starts buckling, you can introduce very cold air to the south where it normally isn't found, and warm air can pour up to the north. This more meridional pattern, it's called, can really give you strong climate extremes. And this is what the media, you've been hearing in the media, might be coming about in the next couple of weeks with what's called a stratospheric warming episode up in the North Polar region. So the question is, where are those dips introducing cold air going to come, and where are the ridges, as we call them, with warm air coming up? And I just looked at the 8 to 14 day outlook from the National Weather Service, and they have the western U.S. getting cold and the eastern U.S. getting warm. So if this vortex exchange is going to occur, it looks like first it's going to deliver the cold air into the west. Now, as we get later in the winter, it could shift over to the east, or the jet could retreat back to the north again and we get shut out. So snow lovers, not a lot of hope in the short term, but there's still a lot of winter to come. Next, please. And that's kind of the epitome of weather and climate joining together to try to give us a feel for things. But getting back to the climate side, these are fresh out. I just grabbed them yesterday, and they go up through 2020. These are New Jersey temperatures from 1895 to 2020 with a simple linear regression. And you can see New Jersey is getting warmer at almost 3 degrees Fahrenheit per century at that rate. And in the more recent couple of decades, it's even at a faster pace than that. And you can see that essentially almost all the warm years have been in the last couple of decades. We just finished the second warmest year of the last 126. We fell in behind 2012, but we were the second warmest. What kept us from number one, frankly, was that April and May being below average, as you saw earlier. But a very warm year indeed. And look at where the cooler years in the last 20 years have been. They're equivalent to the warmer years in most decades of the 20th century. This is not an artifact of station moves. This is not an artifact of equipment changes. This is not an artifact of urban warming. Jersey was pretty urbanized in the last half of the 20th century, let's face it. This is a broad scale warming of New Jersey, and we're seeing it in all seasons. Next, please. You're going to see here in this figure precipitation for the last 126 years. And you can see a slight increase in precipitation over time, about 3 inches per century, but that's based on a 45 plus inch annual change. So that's about a 6%, 6 to 7% increase in precipitation over the last century. But one thing you'll note in particular is that the annual up and down bars there are quite variable in the last couple of decades. In the first 2/3 of the 20th century, you had your wettest years and your driest years. Then you had the big drought of the 1960s, you can see there in the middle of the figure. And since then, there's been quite a bit of interannual variability in the record, including this past decade, where 2011 was the wettest year on record in New Jersey until 2018 came along and just beat it out. So here we still get dry years, but we also get very wet years. So the variability is increased along with the actual magnitude of precipitation when you average the decades together. Next, please. Sea level. We are a coastal state with almost 130 miles of coast, but then we also have the Meadowlands, and we have the Back Bays, and we have Delaware Bay, and up the lower reaches of the Delaware River. And sea level is rising. These two graphs are from Sandy Hook and Atlantic City at the bottom, and they go back about a century, a little less at Sandy Hook, and you can see an upwards march of sea level of about 15 to 18 inches over the last century. And 2/3 of that is due to the oceans getting warmer and thermally expanding, and more water being poured in off ice sheets and melting alpine glaciers. About 1/3 of it is because New Jersey's coastline is sinking. Post-glacial, 20,000 years ago, geologic processes still underway, and also extracting some groundwater from coastal areas through wells. So about 2/3 is due to climate variability and change, about 1/3 due to extraction of water and a geologic post-glacial subsidence of the land in the south part of the state. Next, extremes. This is a tricky one. Are we seeing more extremes in our weather and climate in New Jersey? We certainly have seen it in the climate with the extreme wet years we've seen and the extreme warm years, but how about weather events? These are 4 photos I took the southern part of Manville in Somerset County on 4 different occasions of flooding on the southern part of town. And there's a 5th flood in there that I didn't get a photo of in May of 2014. These 5 floods are the 5 of the 7 largest floods on the Millstone River in the last century. Some of it may have something to do with a little bit of development upstream, but upstream is mostly suburban development. It's not urban development with huge percentages of impervious surfaces. But it's more a fact of having larger rainstorms over basin-sized rainstorms that have resulted in a flooding from a Floyd, from an Irene, and from a series of nor'easters. But the fact they're extremes mean they're unusual. So you have to be patient as a climatologist. Meteorologists can get instant gratification or condemnation based on their forecast. But a climatologist, you have to be patient. This is over 20 years, 5 major floods. It's suggestive of what we expect from a warming climate, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. But it's certainly not proof positive at this point, but something to keep an eye on, a watchful eye on. Next. So what about New Jersey's future climate? What is in store for us? You saw a lot about past, present, and future climate in the show, and it was excellently done, and I'll comment on that a little bit later. But what about Jersey's future climate? All models suggest, and these are numerical climate models that were talked about in the show. They showed you a scene from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab right down Route 1 at the Forrestal campus down near Princeton, where one of the very first climate models was developed in the 1960s. And they continue to do a wonderful job with their modeling program. But there's others around the world as well. And they all suggest temperatures along the mid-Atlantic are going to keep rising in the years, decades, and century plus ahead. How much? Ballpark, 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit still to come, perhaps by the end of the century. And you may say, wow, that's a pretty wide range. And it's more, not so much because the models disagree that much. It's more, we don't know the impact humans are going to have. Remember that in the video, it said that's the big uncertainty, is us. Just what these models run with different emission scenarios. Do we clean up our act and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Do we run it with business as usual, where we keep pouring them into the atmosphere? That's why you see such a large range in these predictions for the second half of the 21st century. So 5 to 10 degrees of warming, steadier increasing precipitation. There's some seasonality to that, though, and it looks like our winters will get wetter, but our summers perhaps not. So hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, that could be a problem with our agriculture in the state, because we're not going to start planting corn in January. We're still going to be growing it during the summer. And if we are short on rainfall and increase evaporation with increasing heat, we could have some problems. And then there's just more energy in the system. There's more energy, more heat in the atmosphere. There's more heat, a lot more heat in the ocean. About 90% of the greenhouse warming heat is being held by the oceans. And there's more moisture in the atmosphere, because a warmer atmosphere has the potential of holding more moisture in it. So we're just primed for more extremes, more strong storms, more flooding, certainly more heat, and yeah, even more drought. And you may say, well, I'm trying to get my way, by talking about more wetness and more dryness. What gives there? Well, think about it. There may be more moisture in the atmosphere, a hotter atmosphere, but if there's no trigger to wring that moisture out of the atmosphere, you're going to have that hot sun pounding down, and that's going to dry things out. And ultimately, that's going to dry out the atmosphere, clean up the clouds, and we're going to have the sun beating down. And you can go from a drought until finally you get a trigger to come along, and that will re-moisten the atmosphere, and then you can have flooding rains. So look for that extremes and variability more in the future. And then sea level is going to keep rising. It's going to keep rising, perhaps another foot by the middle of this century, 3 feet by the end of the century. I think I threw in the next slide here, or a slide. If you go on, oh, I'll get to that in a minute with the sea level. But first, I wanted to talk about this. All right, let's go to this one now. This gives you an idea of seaside heights looking down from above. The areas in light blue will be permanently underwater with a 1 foot, 3 foot, 6 foot sea level rise. Now, 6 feet is lower probability, but 5% is far from zero probability. More likely 3 feet. And that's going to really jeopardize the existence of our barrier island system in New Jersey. I think the next slide, I put in this just, this a lot of numbers. I usually don't like this, but this is based on a report I was involved with, led by Bob Kopp at Rutgers professors, and others from other other universities within New Jersey. Got together at the behest of the Department of Environmental Protection, just a year ago. I guess it was 2019 in December we put this out. And I show you this because I want to drum home the idea that we're talking about probabilities here. I know everybody likes everything to be what we call deterministic. This exactly is going to happen, and it's going to happen now. That's just not the way science works. There's probabilities in terms of the timing and the magnitude of things. And that's why I'm showing this slide, just to make sure I make that point. Now, if we could go back 2 slides, I'll talk about probabilities again. This time, talking thermally. This is, you might have someone say, well, it's still freezing cold today, or last week was brutally cold, or it snowed on May 9th this past year, which it did. And May 9th was one of the coldest May days on record in New Jersey. The wind chill factor at high point was 3 degrees on the 9th of May. But you have to look at these probability distributions here. On the left is a graph where, say, back in the middle to late part of the 20th century, that was the distribution of temperatures across the northern hemisphere in the summer. It really doesn't matter here. And you can see most of them fall in the middle part, but there's limbs to each of them with extremes, and then cold, extreme cold, cold, then on the right, warmer than average and extreme warm. Well, what we're doing is shifting that curve over in the early part of this century, and the distribution is in the graph on the right. Now, it's not as peaked, it's a little more spread out the curve, but notice that with that shift, those hot days that come in are much more likely to happen. The extreme hot days, rather than being a total outlier, are all too frequent, but there's still that probability of having cold conditions. It's not as common, but they can still happen. And you have to remember this. It's not like everything every day, every month, every year is going to be warm. There's still going to be that natural distribution from weather patterns that impact our particular area, or the globe for that matter. So let's jump ahead 4 slides now. I just kind of want to finish up with a little bit of the social science, societal side on this, putting on my broader geographer's hat, although this is out, we're starting to branch out of my direct domain. But I want to point out the impacts of change. And these are happening now in New Jersey. And I go and talk to health officers of communities, and they tell me how the warming is changing the weather-related mortality and heat waves, infectious diseases, and air pollution may be getting hotter, more stagnant days, which result in all kind of respiratory and even pulmonary issues. You look in the forests, there is the southern pine beetle affecting the pinelands. That's a beetle that was kept in check by extremely cold winter temperatures in the pinelands, getting below 0 Fahrenheit a couple of times a winter. Well, I worked with someone from Dartmouth who was looking at this, and I was shocked myself to find out that our coldest of cold winter days in New Jersey are warming at a faster rate than the cold average temperatures in winter. So that's allowing the pine beetle to winter over more often and start decimating our forests. So these are just a couple of examples, and I could go on and on. And hopefully you've read about these. You've maybe attended seminars by others. Maybe others could come in and talk about this in future programs. But we're seeing these things happening already, from our coast to our forests, to our agricultural lands, to our very health and safety, and even our transportation systems as well. So is it a dire picture? Well, we can talk about that a little bit, but again, that comes down to what what we're going to do about this. So anyway, just moving on to the next slide here. This is kind of my preachy set of points I want to make here as we start to finish up. Here are some things I think require attention. We need to learn more about this. Thanks for coming tonight and listening to me babble on. Thanks for watching. And if you haven't watched the Decoding the Weather Machine yet, I absolutely recommend it. The more we understand what's going on, and we all agree something is going on and something critical is coming on, then we can say, well, maybe we need to do something about this. And that brings us to the next point. We need to mitigate. And we saw these in the video. It said suffering mitigation, and the next you can guess is adaptation. Mitigate. We can still do something about this, but let's face it, we're also going to have to adapt, and we're already learning to adapt. The buzzword this day and age is resilient. We're going to have to become more resilient, because we're not going to mitigate ourselves out of this situation. It's just come too far. But we can, as the video said, reduce the need to adapt by increasing our mitigative efforts. And then finally, you have to get out there and be active. The last one here, activism, leadership, join your community, come to talks like this, and then go out and do something personally, something in your community. Write your legislators at the state and national levels, have your say, and then by all means, look at the platforms of the candidates. And if this is an important issue to you, vote accordingly. So a lot that can be done still to give you some glimmers of hope that we're going to be able to get control of this. I like to say, and they hinted at this in the video, we were smart enough to get ourselves into this mess, developing the combustion engine, the industrial society coming on. We were smart enough to get ourselves into this. I'd like to think that we're smart enough to figure our way out of this. I sure don't have all the answers. That's outside my expertise. They did discuss this at some length, although briefly, in the program. But I don't want to leave people feeling hopeless about this. There are things we can still do. We've pretty much set the table for the next 30 years. No matter what we do right now, all the models suggest we're going to get what we get. But the actions we take now are going to have an impact on the last half of this century. And there's a lot of people already alive on this planet who are going to be living through the last half of this century. And it behooves us as the adults of this age, I would say, if I want to get out there and state my claim, we need to do something about this to make a better future for children and our grandchildren, for some of us. Next slide. I just want to finish up with just a couple little things you can do to follow the weather and climate of the Garden State. We have the Rutgers, New Jersey Weather Network. It's about 65 stations from High Point Monument to West Cape May and all points in between. You might just notice in the lower right there, it says East Brunswick. Yes, we have a station at the county waste facility in East Brunswick, another one on campus in New Brunswick. And you can go in and every 5 minutes get a look at the weather that's going on around the state, temperature, precipitation, wind, solar radiation, and so on and so forth. The next slide shows you what you can do, actually, if you want to get out there and volunteer. And there may be some of you listening in who are already part of the COCORAS program in New Jersey. It's a national program. There are about 300 active observers in New Jersey who get a rain gauge, a standard rain gauge for the program shown on the left, and a ruler. And maybe you'll make yourself a snowboard to measure your snow on. And you go out 7 in the morning. When it's snowing, you go out and take a measurement when it hits its deepest depth. You don't necessarily wait till 7 the next morning. And then you go online on your phone or on the computer, and you enter your data. It becomes part of the national database. And the next one shows you what we do in Jersey. We make maps. Every day, every morning, we're making maps. The map on the left shows you spotty rain. Reason why we need so many observers. These are all volunteers. Our 65 automated stations, which measure rain every 5 minutes, aren't on that map. And you can see some areas were wet, some areas are dry, so on and so forth. And on the right is a major storm at the end of this past September, where the pink areas there show roughly 2 or more inches of rain all the way up the western side of the state. Yet look at how little in the green fell down in Cape May, under a couple tenths of an inch, for instance. So that's the COCORAS program. And you can be a citizen science volunteer. Go to cocoras.org. It will show you how to sign on, how to purchase a rain gauge. It's about $35. It's a cheap hobby, the way I like to say. And you can be part of our COCORAS program. So with that, let me sum up the next slide. We do have our weather and climate in New Jersey, and it can go in all sorts of directions. That's what I love about it. I would be bored as heck if I lived in San Diego. But I love the variability, our 4 seasons, and so on and so forth. But we tend to get wild weather, but most often we don't get the worst of the worst. We don't get the worst tornadoes. We tend not to get the worst hurricanes, so on and so forth. So that's not bad. Our climate is changing. I hope I've convinced you of that quite clearly. And the models suggest that it's going to keep changing. It's simple physics of the greenhouse effect. Our observations show it. The physics show it, and our models show it. And with that, we're going to have more extremes. Things may change faster. Impacts are going to expand and become more noteworthy. But again, there's still that hope of combination of mitigative and adaptive actions to address or at least attenuate these conditions. And of course, finish up with the observations. I am more an empiricist than a modeler. It behooves us to keep a keen eye on New Jersey's weather and climate, enjoying it safely, but also being aware that it is something to be reckoned with here on the weather side or in the future as we look to our changing climate. And with that, the next slide shows you that it still does snow in New Jersey, and it's my estimation that this is probably the best use of a golf course. This is from just last month with my cross-country skis out on the 5th fairway of the local golf course. So anyway, thanks for joining tonight. I'd be happy to answer questions. I know some of you may have other things to attend to, but I will be happy to answer questions.
Okay, so we have some that people submitted in advance, and we have some people in the chat now. So I'm going to try to pair them together as much as possible. Terrific. So one's going to be a macro kind of question, followed by something that's a little bit closer in. So the first question is, what is New Jersey as a state doing right now to combat climate change? So what's all happening at the State House? And the other question, which is the much more specific one, where is it? I just had it, and it's up higher up. Hold on, because it's from Jalish, and it is there anything I can do individually about climate change?
Terrific, terrific questions. Start on the big scene. At the state level, climate is in the forefront at NJDEP and in the governor's office. The First Lady is very interested in this. She was trained in Al Gore's camp there. And there are educational efforts underway to integrate climate into all, not only all grades, but all subjects. I've actually met with Department of Education folks to give them this kind of primer, if you will, just to take away the fear factor from those who are involved with English and social studies, and talk about how we can bring it into the math curriculum, and of course, all aspects of science curriculum. So it's got a great push at the state level right now. And I hope that continues into the future. Bringing it down to the local level, there's local activities going on, green teams within communities, and then down to the personal level. I already mentioned you write a letter to your congressman, and that can make an impact. You join a local organization. You support a non-governmental organization that's out preserving land or doing research into our environment and the impacts of climate change on our environment. Get on a planning board if that's your specialization. If you're a communicator, write a piece, an op-ed, and submit it to a local paper or online resource. And then ultimately, think about using less energy and using greener energy, because it's really both involved here. Electric vehicles, solar panels on your roof. Let's not forget water. That's really, really important. Use your water more prudently. Don't drown your lawns. Be aware of every drop of water you use, not just in the dry years, but any year. All of these things, and it's the thermostat is important, let's face it. And remember, there's 9 million of us. So what your actions do, if we multiply it by millions, that makes a big difference. So keep that in mind as you do something personally and say, what difference can it make? Well, it can make a big difference, let alone perhaps setting an example for your kids, or the kids out there can set examples and get their parents moving on these things.
Okay, so I have another good pairing of someone who submitted in advance and someone in the chat right now. Someone had asked, at what point would climate change make parts of New Jersey Shore uninhabitable? You did have that slide. Or even parts of the eastern seaboard where there is already flooding at high tide. And then the live question was specifically, where is it? I believe it was about Louisiana, yes. So Jayesh had asked that, will Louisiana flood at the rising sea level? So is it just happening on the East Coast? Is it happening all around us? Is it going to be pinpointing or targeted depending on, the level of impact, how everything, moves around?
No, and as the video even pointed out, it's everywhere globally. Now we're learning that some areas are more vulnerable than others. Without getting into any details of ocean circulation and the melting of sea ice, melting of glacial ice sheets and all, and rebounding of land, it gets complicated. But the fact is, if you're a huge portion of the global population lives at or near sea level, and this goes far beyond New Jersey, far beyond Norfolk and Miami Beach. In fact, there's far more vulnerable people in Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, other parts of the world where they're already marginalized by the impoverished lives they live, and they're particularly vulnerable. They mentioned the Marshall Islands and other atolls out there in the Pacific and other low island nations. Their very existence, it depends on trying to get this under control. So going close to the Jersey Shore, you saw that one image of Seaside Heights. We get a 6-foot rise in sea level. We've lost our barrier defenses basically. Are we going to build seawalls to encapsulate Long Beach Island? Probably not. We're going to retreat inland. That's a word people don't want to hear along the coast, and I'm not advocating for it now. I'm advocating for a prudent actions as we seek to live along our coast as long as we can and as safely as we can. But we're going to be facing later in this century decisions that we're only just talking about now. We're going to need to take action further in the future. We're already seeing this sunny day or fair weather flooding. They mentioned the King Moon in there. We're already seeing that flooding because remember, just a foot rise in sea level doesn't just come a foot up the beach. It spreads out. You have to use your geometry there and see what an impact it can have. We're for the time being, it's the major storms that are going to do the most damage. But in the future, the minor storms are going to start doing major damage. And then if the sea level gets out of control, we're going to have a hard time just sustaining operations along our coast of New Jersey and elsewhere around the world.
Okay, so I'll give you the easier one, and then I'll give you the more complex one. How about that? So, question. Well, this is an important one. So we talked about the whole personal responsibility, water, green energy. Amy asks, where is there reliable information on clean energy businesses from which we can purchase electricity? It's hard to know who to trust in this area. We get these things in the mail. Like, where is there a good clearinghouse that is at the state level of finding that information, or are we still really in the Wild West about all of this right now?
When I don't know something, I'll admit I don't know it. I really don't know where to go look. I would go look at the Board of Public Utilities in New Jersey and contact them. That would be a good place to start. And then go online and look carefully around there. I don't know if you go to your gas and electric purveyors right now, the programs they have, I can't speak to them, but they're hopefully going to be conscientious about doing the best in the long term for them, their business, as well as their customers. But perhaps the BPU on the federal level, I'm really not well versed enough to say much about it. But the point you made, though, with your question is, yes, be careful out there before you make a decision that you or an investment that you might regret. But I tell you, I'd say that more carefully 10 years ago than I say it now, because things are really starting to fall into place better than they were 10, 15 plus years ago.
Okay, let's go to the one that's going to definitely be talking about the world of deniers and misinformation. Is something, obviously with topics of any sort of information now is important. So this one's a little bit unique, and then I'll roll back to another one. So Sandy asks, how can there be climate change deniers in the science community? So people and specialists, that you might know or interact with. Is there any valid research out there that really says we're not responsible for climate change and thus do not have to mitigate it?
Yeah, that's kind of made the news this week with a colleague of mine at the University of Delaware being told to leave the White House by someone directing the White House science program who is an atmospheric scientist who is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, who I happen to know, Kevin Druckenmeier. There is still a small group of skeptics. Mind you, scientists by our nature are skeptical. But we're talking about people that are, getting past the skeptical side to just simply denying the science of it for whatever the reason might be, and let them try to explain it, or you try to explain it. The vast majority of climate scientists see a huge human footprint on the climate system and what we're doing. Sure, solar variability has had some effect. volcanic activity, some effect. Carbon dioxide does nurture vegetation, but it's shown that, too much of something or too fast a change can have an impact. So I really can't speak for those people. They are vocal. They are a minority. They seemingly tried to pull a fast one illegally, from what I understand, this past week, by putting a signature on something, a White House signature that they weren't permitted to do. I don't know how that's going to unfold. It's really very unfortunate, because I do know some of these people, and they're smart people, but they're just seeing things just a little bit differently than the mainstream, and that's 95+% of the climate community is seeing things. So sometimes I just have to put my hands up and say, what are you doing? What are you thinking? It's frustrating.
Okay, so I've got one more question, and then we're going to wrap up and talk about our next event, since you are the kickoff of this whole series. So we talked a lot about misinformation, people who deny that. Is there really good sources that lay people could go to find out the most up-to-date and accurate information about climate change? Do you have any recommendations for people?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't have been NOAA with what they were trying to put out this week, because that's just, recycled stuff they've been doing for years. But, NASA has some good sites. EPA had a good program. They had about 75 climate indicators that they were updating just about annually until about 4 years ago. One of them was mine, on snow cover extent in the Northern Hemisphere. I hope we're going to see that program rev back up. So the EPA, NOAA has great data and good science being done within it. And then you can go to reputable institutions, in addition to Rutgers, but also at Rutgers, where we have a very active climate program, from paleoclimates to looking into the climate future. And I do recommend several programs at Rutgers that look at the science, and there's a wonderful group that's looking more at social science issues at Rutgers, and we all talk to each other, we all interact. It's just a wonderful group at Rutgers, and we're joined by folks at Princeton, and down at Stockton or Rowan or other schools, Montclair State, and you name it. So I don't want to forget the engineering schools, Stevens and NJIT. A lot of good schools. And then, of course, we interact with people around the world. So, look at your sources. If you're not sure of something one place, go look something else. Contact people. A lot of us like to talk about this, besides me babbling on, as I said. It takes a little work sometimes to make sure you're getting the straight story, but don't be afraid to ask. Oh, and another thing I might recommend, there's a primer that's put out by the Royal Academy and the National Academy of Sciences of the U.S. And they just did an update. I was on the Academy's Atmospheric Science and Climate Committee when this was first put out in 2014, and got a chance to do some review of it. I did not write it. And they've just updated a year ago. So if you search at the National Academy of Science, if you saw my email, I can send you the link to it. I can't cite it off the top of my head, but you could Google it and find it. National Academy of Science and the Royal Society Climate Primer. I think it's about 50 pages or whatever. And it's what I always send people to if they want, not just the one-pagers, but not the full textbook look at things. This is a really good read.
So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for your time and sharing your information. I'll put your email address in the chat box as soon as I'm done wrapping up. So thank you so much. And I want to let everyone know about the next event. And we really appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule. I know you're going to be going back to be teaching soon. Rutgers is going to be back in session. So I know it's going to be important. So let me share the next event with everyone. And it's going to be Sustainable Agricultural Projects in Zimbabwe with Dr. Chait Chirenji, who is Professor of Environmental Science and Sustainability at Stockton University, so a little bit further down the road in South Jersey. He'll be talking about the climate impacts too, so basically looking at it from a project from a different continent, which I think is important for us to, be aware of and everything. So I also want to let us and thank, besides thanking Dr. Robinson, our community partners. We could not have done this event without you guys, besides with our regular partners for Option Green, the Friends of the East Brunswick Environmental Commission, who actually were able to book Dr. Robinson for night. We want to thank Highland Park Public Library, Matawan-Aberdeen Public Library, New Brunswick Public Library, North Brunswick Public Library. You're getting the theme here, right? Old Bridge Public Library, Plainsboro Public Library, and South Brunswick Public Library. So once again, thank you so much for coming out tonight and wanting to be part of these important discussions, bringing in your feedback. We hope that you learn something. You're inspired to write to politicians, take your skills in writing an op-ed piece, going to local councils, volunteering your time. It's important now more than ever to have our voices heard about climate change because we're the ones who can make that impact. So thank you, everyone. Be safe and be well, and hope to see you next month. Goodbye.
Thank you for joining us for this week's Encore presentation. To join us for live programs or to learn more about the East Brunswick Public Library, visit our website at ebpl.org.